Good morning all. So today's video is going to be looking at the poem Mending Wall by Robert Frost. Alright, so before we get into reading the poem, a few little things to think about. So if we look at the title, Mending Wall, okay, we want to break down that title and look at what it could mean. So I want you to take the word wall first and just think about what is the most basic function of a wall. Okay, so we're surrounded by walls all the time, but have we ever thought about what is the most basic function? Why do we build walls? What are they there for? Then I want to think about the idea of the word mending, and does the idea of mending fit with the fundamental basic principles of a basic function of what a wall is there for? Alright, so this video we're going to be looking at understanding the language and the storyline of this poem. We want to connect the themes of the poem with some information which we might know about Frost's life. We want to examine the language of the poem in depth, and we want to explore some deeper meanings of the poem. Now, if we go back to that question I gave you at the start, the idea of a wall. Alright, so the basic idea, the basic function of a wall separates two things. Okay, now we see walls all the time. There's walls in your house, which are there to separate out the rooms. They're there to hold up the roof and the ceiling as well, but fundamentally they're there to separate the rooms, just like walls out in the countryside and between fields are there to separate land. Walls are there to separate things out. The idea of mending then, mending is to fix, and you would usually bring the idea of fixing more with the idea of coming together. Alright, so if we take look at this in terms of relationships, the idea of if you're mending a relationship, you're trying to bring things back together, and so there is somewhat slightly oxymoronic aspect to the title of this poem, in that mending gives us the idea of bringing things together, whereas a wall is there to separate. Okay, now there is obviously the idea that they are just going and mending the wall, right? But it is called Mending Wall. So is it the wall that's mended? Is there a contradiction in those terms, or are they just going out to actually fix up a wall? Okay, so if we look at the poem itself, first of all, Mending Wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two could pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair, where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbour know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line, and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go. To each the boulders that are fallen to each, and some are lows and some are so nearly balls, we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is we do not need the wall, he is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbours. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbours? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offence. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, and it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbours. Okay, so this poem, the phrase good fences make good neighbours gets repeated in the poem. So we really need to look at this phrase when we're looking at the poem. So the phrase is used twice within the poem, and it's a phrase which occurs in many different cultures. I want you to think about, what does this phrase actually mean? What does this suggest about people and our relationships? And do you think this phrase still holds true in the modern world? Okay, so I'm going to flick back to the poem. I'm going to suggest you pause here and think about the whole poem. So what is the plot? Okay, what's going on in the poem? But also think about that particular phrase in detail. Okay, so you can pause the poem now. Okay, so the plot of the poem here is it's based when Frost is working in a rural community in New England, and he is working as a farmer. And one of the jobs that he has to do in springtime is to go out and fix the walls. So the walls are damaged by the weather and by the freezing of the rain that seeps into the walls. It damages the walls over the winter time, that with the wind and everything like that, and the walls start to fall down. Now, one of the jobs is for him to go out and try and fix up the walls. Okay, and so when he comes out and he sees, okay, there's holes all over the wall, he calls his neighbour who's on the other side of the wall and says, look, the wall needs to be mended, it needs to be fixed, let's go out and mend the wall. And that's what they do. So they both go out, they stand on either side of the wall, so Frost is on his own side of the wall and the neighbour is on the opposite side of the wall, and they walk along the wall together and they pick up any rocks that fall, any stones that fall on their side, they pick it up and they replace it. Okay, so what we need to think about here is the two men are working together, right? They are together in this single task. However, when they're doing it, there's definitely a separation, and that's what the wall is there for. That's why they're on either side of the wall. There's a separation between them. Even though they're working to complete a similar task, they are keeping themselves separate from each other. Now, this obviously can be connected with the ideas to come up in tufted flowers. So when you look at tufted flowers, and he talks about men working alone, whether they work together or apart, you can connect that over with this idea here. But here, also here we need to look at the metaphorical idea of what's going on. The concept of them being separate is not just a physical separation. He is trying to comment on our relationships in general and how we treat our neighbours and why we keep walls between us. Why do we block people out? Why are we so insistent on that privacy, on that level of privacy and that level of protection of our lives, that we keep up metaphorical walls between us and our neighbours, which could be representative of anyone really, but probably people who are close to us and people that we trust. All right, we see in this poem that he does seem to trust the man he is working with, and so why do they need a wall if they trust each other? Okay. There is the idea that comes down when he says, stay where you are until our backs are turned. This wall doesn't actually really physically serve a function. It is more the knowledge that the wall is there. If the wall is there, then they're happy to understand, okay, there's a wall there, we're protected. And that's what's important, is the illusion of the wall. It's a facade that they put up, that they are protected from each other. Okay? But the actual function of the wall is debunked. It's not necessarily needed. So if we think about this in terms of our own lives, you will know that our neighbours will, over years of living beside someone, your neighbours know a lot about you. And that's a natural part of a long-term relationships. When you've known people for years and years, they learn a lot about you, especially if you're in a small community or you're very close, physically close to your neighbours. They will know a lot, maybe more than you possibly would like them to know, but you trust them with that information because they're your neighbours, and it's a reciprocal relationship. You'll both know things about each other that you just, you'll keep private, and you'll appreciate, and that the others need that kind of privacy. And that is part of a neighbourly relationship. So why do we have to put up these fake walls, this idea of a wall to protect ourselves? Why are we so obsessed with protecting ourselves when these people already know a lot about us? So that's an idea that's coming across here. Now, he's not saying that walls shouldn't be used, so I'm going to go into this in a few minutes. He is very much, Frost appreciates that walls are needed to protect commodities, and that's what he's talking about here when there's the cows. The cows represent commodities and value. Okay, so he's fine with there being a wall there, but when they get to the pine and the apple orchard, he's saying that there's absolutely no need for a wall here. Okay, there's no danger in this area between them, and yet the neighbour keeps the wall up. He still wants protection. So what he's asking us to think about is, why do we need that protection from people? Why do we insist upon that protection if we don't need it? Okay, so there's the physical. You can take this as a physical wall as well. Okay, that we put walls around our land. Why do we have to do that? Why can it not be more communal? But also in the metaphorical sense of why we always trying to keep ourselves so private and so, keep a facade of complete, that we are almost perfect and not willing to show our vulnerabilities, perhaps, to our neighbours. when it's irrelevant if they know, but they already know our certain vulnerabilities about us. Why are we so ardent to not show that? Why are we so ardent to protect ourselves from them? Okay, so, but the neighbour isn't really willing to accept this, and that's where this idea of good fences make good neighbours. It's the old proverb, and it comes from a number of different cultures. This kind of proverb, it's quite common, and the idea is that in order to have a good relationship with your neighbours, you need to have a certain amount of separation, and the neighbour is not willing to think about that or question that concept. He has grown up with that concept. We know that it's his father saying in the third last line, and he is very much sticking with that. So even though Frost is asking him to question it, okay, and he's doing it in somewhat of a playful way now. So Frost is not being overly critical of his neighbour. Okay, I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. It's a game to Frost. Okay, he's playing a bit of a game here. He's wondering, could he convince his neighbour to think critically about his life decisions? But the neighbour's not really willing to do that. This links in then to the idea that we know about Frost. Felt very much trapped between different classes in society and different circles within his life, in that he was connected with the very highly educated and usually quite well off poets of the time, and he had friendships with them, but he never truly felt quite at home with them, because he came from a very different world. He came from a very working class world, and he was himself, he worked on farms, he did a lot of manual labour, and he enjoyed it. But when he's doing that kind of work, he doesn't feel like he's not intellectually stimulated by the neighbours, and that's where he is at the moment. He's finding that his neighbours, he's playing a bit of a game with the neighbour, but he's finding that the neighbour is not intellectually, critically thinking about things, and that is something that he is kind of commenting on. Why are people not more open to critique things? And we'll see he makes some comments about the neighbour and his views of the neighbour towards the end of the poem when we get to that in a bit more detail. If we look, so just thinking about that phrase, good fences make good neighbours, like I said, the phrase is all about we need that people, the idea that you protect yourself from those around you, and that makes relationships stronger and more clear cut, and we feel protected, so people are happier with that kind of idea. It suggests that we can never be truly close to the people around us if we always need to have a barrier and protection up. And most people would say it very much holds true to the modern world. We talk about this with social media and the internet a lot. You'll have heard this, throughout school, that we need to have walls up in order to protect ourselves, and that is very much, that's what Frost doesn't critique that. He's not saying you should be totally open with everyone. Where there's something that needs to be protected, yes, protect yourself, but be critical about when you need to put up these extra protections. On the internet, very much so needed, but perhaps do we need to keep those walls up around the same walls up around people we're close to, or should we be more willing to kind of show our vulnerable side to certain people? Okay, so going into the poem, we'll break it down into a few different sections, and the poem is written as a single stanza. I'm just breaking it down in sections here for ease of analysis. So lines 1 to 11. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair, where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at springtime mending we find them there. So, a few questions here, so I'm going to ask you to pause in a second, but questions I want you to think about. What does the poet suggest to us about walls in the very first line? What do you think the hunters in this poem represent? And what do you think is the poet's opinion on the walls in his life and the gaps which have appeared? Okay, so I'm going to suggest pause here for 2 minutes, think about those three questions. It's much better that you think about things yourself and come to your own opinion, your own understanding, rather than just being told things. We need to be active in learning of this poetry. Okay, so what does the poet suggest to us about walls in the very first line? He's suggesting that there's something out there that is against people putting up walls. There's something there that, physically, we're talking about the idea of nature, acting against the wall, but metaphorically there's something there that naturally the walls we build up will break down over time. There's something inherent that means that we do not want walls around us. We like to have a bit more openness, and so we are breaking them down over time. The hunters here, and this is the important point, that he's not talking about breaking down all walls. The hunters are forces of malice, okay, malicious people who are coming out and trying to cause harm. Okay, so we can see the cruelty of the hunters when they talk about they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs, that they would cause pain just for the joy of causing pain. Now, if you think about this in a more literal scenario, bring the metaphor into the real world, you might be thinking about, is the hunter, say, the bully in school? The rabbit is the victim of bullying, and that the hunter is trying to hurt the victim purely to please the yelping dogs, so which could be the crowd or just people around, that the hunter is willing to do whatever they need to do, be as cruel as they need to be, in order to get that reaction, that approval from the crowd around, which would be the yelping dogs. Okay, so that is, that's what that the hunters here are people who are out to cause harm. But he's saying that the way the walls have been broken down between him and his neighbour is not to do with this malice. It is not to do with trying to harm each other. It's just over time they've broken down. So there's a very clear distinction here between, yes, you need walls to protect yourself from danger. He is not in any way questioning that. He very much supports that idea. But what he's asking here is, do we need to keep those walls up around everyone? Is there times when we could be more open with our neighbours and let those walls fall? And the poet's opinion of the walls' life is that you would probably say that the gaps that are appearing in this wall seem natural. They seem like just a part of the passage of time, rather than being something particularly dangerous. It's just a natural part of a long-term relationship, that these walls will break down and they will show these vulnerabilities to each other. So the walls that he's talking about, the gaps that they're going out and mending in the poem, are not ones that need to be mended to protect from malice. They are ones that are being mended due to lack of comfort, and due to this proverb of good fences make good neighbours. So going into a bit more detail on some of these lines. At the start, the poet opens with the idea of walls being broken down. There's something out there that time acts upon the wall to destroy it. It causes such big gaps that two can pass abreast. Implies that the gaping holes allow free movement and no real protection. And they're so big that surely if there was a problem with that wall, it would have been fixed before now. It's been broken down so much over time that it's irrelevant that it's there. If it was a big issue, it would have been fixed much sooner. Okay? It's now just being fixed out of for reasons of comfort and reasons of of habit. And going back to that proverb, we are told that the holes are not made by hunters, so they're not here. It's not being made by malice or people trying to obliterate the wall. It's just breaking down over time. Rabbit and dogs are a metaphor representing the cruel nature of the hunters, who would see suffering just for pleasure. Okay, and the gaps in the walls are not made maliciously. It's only when he goes looking for the walls, he has to go and search for these holes. And when he finds them, he decides that's when they fix them. But the gaps in the wall have been there for a long time, and they've been gone unnoticed. So are they really that big of an issue here? Okay, moving on to just the middle section of the poem. We're looking at lines 12 to 27. I let my neighbour know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves and some so nearly balls, we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is we do not need the wall, he is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbours. So I'm going to ask you to pause here as well and just think, look at the questions. Why do you think the neighbour is adamant on building a wall? And what does the poet mean when he refers to this as a game which comes to little more? Okay, so we'll pause now. So the question, why do you think the neighbour is adamant on building a wall? And it seems that the neighbour is very much reliant on this wall for his own sense of self-protection. Okay, but it is just a sense within his mind that is necessary, that the wall is necessary, and we see that through when he talks about stay where you are until our backs are turned. So I've talked about this already. This is an illusion. The wall is just they need to know the wall is there. They don't actually, the physicality, the actual presence of the wall is irrelevant as long as they think it's there. And this idea of a game, this brings the kind of fun aspect into what Frost talked about. He sees a humorous side of what they're doing. Oh, why are we building up this wall? It's completely irrelevant. Okay, so he sees a bit of humor going on here. And he refers to the game because he sees that it's not important. Okay, Frost sees past the what's going on here. He can see the illusion that they're building, and that the wall is little more than a game. It's not actually relevant to their lives. Alright, so going into some annotations, there appears to be a cordial relationship between the narrator and the neighbour, suggesting a mutual trust and respect. They are happy to go out and work together. He sees the problem, he just calls his neighbour, oh yeah, we gotta go fix the wall again. And they have that friendly, cordial relationship and they go out and do the work together. But they keep this wall between them as they go. There is a distance and an unwillingness to accept their vulnerabilities. Okay? They are not willing to show, even though they've let the gaps fall. They are putting it back up as soon as they realise they've let it go. They're not consciously ready to make that, to show those kind of vulnerable sides. The wall does not go back up easily, and the difficulty of building is coupled with the precarious structure makes us question why they are putting so much time and effort into the wall. So it's a hard job to put this wall back up. And metaphorically, once you show people your vulnerable side, it's hard to hide from that again. It can be very damaging to a relationship to hide from that again. Right? So we have to question here, why are they putting so much effort into this wall if we know that it's not really necessary? And then we look at until our backs are turned. We understand the importance of the wall is their understanding of its existence more than its actual functionality. This is a game. And then finally, even when the wall is clearly not needed, so when we get to where they have trees on either side, so it's the apple orchard on Frost's side and the pine trees on the neighbour's side, still the neighbour insists upon the use of the old proverb. He's not really willing to critically think in the way that Frost wants him to, which we'll come into in a few minutes. And he keeps going back to this, he relies on this old proverb. That's where he relies on the knowledge of the past rather than thinking about his own life. And he uses this proverb to support his case that good friends make good neighbours. Okay, coming on to the final section then. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbours? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offence. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top, in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying. And he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbours. So a few questions here. What is the tone of the narrator at this point in the poem? What words or phrases suggest this? I'd rather he said it for himself. What does the narrator want the neighbour to admit? And does the narrator expect the neighbour to change his views? So I'm going to suggest just pause here for another 2 minutes and just think about those questions. Okay, so the questions, what is the tone of the narrator at this point in the poem? What phrase suggests this? And there's kind of a somewhat humorous, playful tone here. We can see this when he talks about, I want to put it, spring is the mischief in me. Okay, he's feeling mischievous. There's a bit of a game going on here. I'd rather he said it for himself. What he wants the neighbour to admit is that he wants him to look past the proverb and say, we're putting up the wall because I want the wall up and I want to feel protected. Rather than just going, oh well, good fences make good neighbours, good fences make good neighbours. He wants the neighbour to think for himself and just admit he wants the wall up and just say it out rather than hiding behind this proverb. And the narrator doesn't seem to want to expect the neighbour to change his views at all here. Okay? It's just a game, it's just a thought experiment. He's trying to see, can he get the neighbour to think about it? He doesn't really expect him to. So if we look at the notes here, the narrator decides to question why they are building the walls at all and looks to make his neighbour think about this. Okay. The cows represent commodities. And this we look at many cultures throughout history where cows have been a very highly valued commodity, where a huge monetary value, hugely influential bartering systems, and that's what he's been using them here. They're representative. The cows, yes, in the context of the physical wall, it is a physical cow, but they also represent value. The poet wants to establish the function of any wall. He questions why we put up barriers of protection when there is no need to protect anything. So why are we putting up barriers around things that don't need to be protected? What's the point of it? The darkness, then, he moves in darkness, as it seems to me, implies the neighbour is not thinking. Okay, so Frost becomes somewhat critical and somewhat, not quite insulting, but he is making fun of his neighbour here. He calls him like an old stone savage. Right? So he's calling him, he's saying that he's a person from history. He's not someone who's modern thinking. And he says he's working in darkness. He's working in ignorance of his actions. He's not thinking about what he's doing. Okay, so you can think about that imagery there of the old stone savage in the darkness being quite important to understanding Frost's view of his neighbours at this section of the poem. The poet is critical of the neighbour's general acceptance of the need for a wall and seems to almost pity his acceptance of proverbs without questioning them. Okay, so there's a bit of pity coming across here in the tone. This can be seen to represent Frost's love of critical thinking. So we know that Frost worked as a teacher and he was very into inspiring critical thinking from his students. And is he trying to do the same here with his neighbour? Is he trying to get his neighbour to think critically? And is that what he's enjoying about the situation? Is he enjoying that aspect of the situation, even though he knows he probably won't be successful in this instance? Okay, so a few general comments, and I know, sorry, I'm speaking quite fast. I just realised this video is going on quite long at this stage, so do feel free to pause, and if you want to take down any of the notes that I'm going to be rushing through quite quickly here. So the poem is a reflection on the nature of walls in our lives and questions why people build them or tear them down, the general need for walls, why are we putting up protections without thinking about it, why do we put it up? Would we be better off if we were more open in certain areas? Not all areas, in certain areas. There's a playfulness to the building of the wall and describes the game. There's a sense of something unknown and magical holding the wall in place, and this links into the illusion of what the wall is. The poet questions if walls are good or bad things and wishes to get his neighbour to question this too, though the neighbour has a general acceptance of the need for the walls in life, so the neighbour is not really willing to critically think and question this. Like I said already, he sees the neighbour as an old stone savage, unwilling to engage in deep thought. He sees that the neighbour has an outdated attitude to life. That don't rely on past knowledge, think about things yourself. The wall in the poem is both literal, so we talk about it's linked to Frost's experience as a farmer, but it's also a metaphor for the separation of people or even countries keep from each other. The proverb, good fences make good neighbours, suggests both that people should not intrude upon those around them, respect each other's boundaries, but also that people are hiding something. And this is the aspect that Frost dislikes of it. Frost is not trying, by saying we don't need a wall, he's not trying to intrude on his neighbour's privacy. There's been gaps in the wall for a long time. He's never intruded, he's never went over. The neighbour didn't even know, neither even knew the gaps were there. He doesn't want the wall gone so he can intrude. He's just saying, what's the point in the wall? It's irrelevant. So, unless you're hiding something. And the neighbour isn't really hiding something. He's saying, if you're hiding something, say, you want the wall up, right? But don't be constantly reliant on a wall if it's not necessary. Much like Tuft of Flowers, this is about human connection. So this concept that comes up in a number of Frost poems. The idea of human connection, and think about there's a great amount lost when we build these walls. The connection is being separated. And the poem has often been connected with ideas around the Berlin Wall, and this is where you're taking poems from the past. Now, the poem is not written about the Berlin Wall. You can be really, really clear on that. The poem was written 50 years before the Berlin Wall was ever built. So think about this chronologically. What we're saying is that the message in this poem is somewhat, it transcends the time between it. So the message in the poem is a similar message that was still being talked about years and years later when the Berlin Wall went up and then was, fell down, or was torn down. Sorry, it was taken down in the years later. What was it? 1989 when they started to take it down. So there is a lesson here And if you want to bring that a bit more modern, we haven't been talking about it so much recently, but Donald Trump's wall that was being talked about all over the news up to a few years ago, and even the borders that are going up throughout a number of different countries to do with the refugee crisis and things like that. We need to think, what is the function of those walls? Are they just an illusion to make people feel like there's protection there? Is protection needed? Are they just putting up walls for no real reason? Okay, so it's a great deal of symbolism in here around what the wall and neighbours represent. We've talked about that a number of times, throughout the video. The poem is written in unrhymed iambic pentameter, and this gives a sense. I'll talk about this in some of the other poems in a bit more detail. Frost writes with structure. He just doesn't use rhyme. Okay, Frost is not writing in free verse, and that is, you have to understand this difference. There is very much strict structure to Frost's work, okay? And this adds a lyricism to the poetry. However, he doesn't use rhyme because he feels that he wants to write in a more natural and colloquial way, which is what he's quite famous for, is writing in the dialect of the people of New England, and writing in a very much a colloquial, conversational manner. And for us as readers, we can see that we're being drawn into a more personal experience, possibly, of Frost and of his life because of this conversationalness. But he is still a poet who believes in the need for structure within poetry. The tone of the poem is largely light-hearted and mischievous. Frost wants to seriously question the nature of walls, but he is doing it with a sense of fun. He doesn't expect to be, this isn't a poem where he's trying to change the world and trying to make us all think we need to tear down walls. He's just having a bit of a thought experiment, thinking, are these needed? And he wishes people would think about it, but he knows his neighbour actually won't. Frost not only questions the need for walls in the poem, but through the neighbour is somewhat critical of those people in the world who are not willing to engage in critical thinking. So here we can see that this poem very much is implying the need for critical thinking in all areas of life. So the neighbour is an allegorical representation of a large segment of society, and perhaps inspired by Frost's neighbours in New England. He's quite well known for never really being overly happy no matter where he was. If he was with the poets and the kind of upper classes, he felt out of place because he didn't know how to speak to them about their world in some ways. And then when he was in the more working class place with people he'd kind of grown up with, he felt that he wasn't being intellectually stimulated. Okay, so a few questions to think about with this poem as you take it away. What is the poem really about? You should have a good opinion, personal opinion on that. What do you think the poem is really about? Why do you think the poet has used a light-hearted tone throughout the poem rather than engaging in more serious questioning? If you look at this, so what poems I'm talking about there is Tuft of Flowers and Mending Wall. We've looked at so far. It could be said to be about human connections. What similarities are there between Frost's views in Tuft of Flowers and Mending Wall?